Until the lion learns how to write, every story will glorify the hunter is an African proverb. It states that until you tell your story, it will always be told from the perspective of the oppressor. Narratives are powerful. They can plant ideas, change minds, and distort truths. There are numerous studies on the impact of narratives and the influences they have on an individual and a societal level. If a narrative is repeated often enough, it is solidified in the minds of the masses and perceived as being truthful. When a group of people are continuously shown in a certain light, the public start to believe these narratives, leading to changes in their own behaviour towards those portrayed. Over the decades, this has been prevalent in the Western media in relation to Islam, Muslims and Muslim-led countries. Islam is continually portrayed as being violent and incompatible with Western values and society. And, like any narrative, if repeated often enough, it becomes the dominating story in the public's affair and is perceived as reality. The constant peddling of the narrative may also cause some Muslims to start questioning their own beliefs, especially if they're not aware of alternative narratives. And although it may seem that the hijacking of the Muslim identity took place following 9/11, there has been much evidence to suggest it began decades before. Because in order to malign a whole demographic, the vilification has to be instigated years before in order for the masses to quickly absorb agenda-driven narratives. Once these narratives have become accepted by the public, the powerful can push their agendas with less public opposition. Let's take a look at when this has happened in history and what the consequences were. The rise of anti-Semitism. The use of propaganda to dehumanize and vilify the Jewish community heavily contributed to the rise of Nazi political power. Filmography, radio, music, publications, art and education were all used to build a narrative of Hitler as a strong leader that Germany needed to become a great nation again. Moreover, it was used to push hostility towards Jews, socially, legally and physically excluding them from society. This narrative painted Jews as backward, violent and as sexual predators who were a burden on German society, and if not controlled, they would take over Germany. As a result, hundreds and thousands of Jews were rounded up and poisoned in gas chambers. They were hunted out of their homes and taken to concentration camps where they were starved, tortured and often worked to death. The rise of transatlantic slavery. Narratives were also used to keep the transatlantic slavery alive. Slaves were depicted as unintelligent, useless, barbaric, sexually violent, and if ever set free they would cause havoc in society. This narrative justified kidnapping Africans from their homeland, binding them in chains of slavery to work day and night for free. Slaves had no rights, entitlements, or even allowed a lifestyle choice, stuck in a country that's not their own. But more disturbingly, narrative justified the need to keep black people under control in brutal, inhumane conditions. These narratives were eventually collectively coined as racism and are still used today to advocate oppressive control of black people. The rise of Islamophobia. More recently, the rise of Islamophobia has been propagated using the same methods of dehumanization that were used for the Jewish and black communities. In order to understand the rise of Islamophobia, one must understand when and how the rise of Orientalism occurred. Orientalism is the reference to the West's patronizing representations of people from Asia, North Africa and the Middle East. Professor Edward Said, a Palestinian-American academic, political activist and literary critic, stated, "Arabs, for example, are thought of as camel-riding terrorist hook-nosed Wiener lechers whose undeserved wealth is an affront to real civilization." Jack Shaheen, a lecturer in racial and ethnic stereotype, stated that as many as 900 Hollywood films painted Arabs in a negative light, promoted stereotypes and propagated cultural misrepresentations. By producing these racist narratives, the West created feelings of superiority, giving leverage to conquer resources in Africa, the Middle East and Asia because the civilized West was more deserving. Shaheen writes that Arabs were depicted in films as enemies of the West, being brutal, heartless, inferior, religious fanatics that were adamant on terrorizing civilized Westerners. To this day, popular American TV programs continue to paint Muslims as enemies of the West. And this dehumanization hasn't only been limited to Hollywood. Bollywood cinema has not been shy in depicting Muslims as terrorists and the enemies of the state either. The impact of repeated narratives has an impact on how these communities are viewed and consequently how the public will treat them. So what are the consequences of such poisonous narratives in Western society for Muslims? In 2017-18, the Home Office reported religious hate crimes were up by 40% in a year across England and Wales, with 50% of those hate crimes being directed at Muslims, predominantly Muslim women. Muslims have to bear the brunt of hate stirred up by far-right organisations. They have to endure continuous discrimination in the public sphere and suffer whilst their place of worship and schools are attacked. Muslims also face discrimination within the workplace. In 2018, a study by the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights highlighted the discrimination Muslims continuously face in relation to employment. These include not being considered for interviews due to ethnic-sounding names, the way they look, or not being paid the same as their white colleagues. Muslims have also been subject to spying. In 2010, a report found an undercover police operation took place in the UK whereby thousands of Muslims were placed under permanent surveillance. This surveillance soon dripped down into nurseries and schools, where toddlers as young as 3 years old were monitored for signs of radicalisation. The result of Islamophobia has also made way for the massacre of millions of Muslims around the world. Hundreds and thousands of Muslims were killed in the Iraq and Afghanistan war. Across the globe, many more have been attacked, killed, raped, their homes destroyed, livelihoods taken away from them, or been wrongly imprisoned. It's ironic that the dominant narrative is that Islam and Muslims are barbaric and irrational, when in reality Muslims are the biggest victims of terrorism, including Western state terrorism. Negative narratives prevent the empowerment of people and communities. They dehumanise people to the extent they become free from independent thought, killing their confidence and creativity. Muslims were and are great inventors, intellectuals, and contribute heavily to society on a daily basis, but the Islamophobic narrative doesn't allow the masses to acknowledge this. And as we have made no or little attempt to challenge the narrative painted about Muslims by not writing our own story, we allowed the massacre of our fellow brethren. We allowed our rights to be taken away from us and allowed Islam and its principles to be attacked. A strong Muslim narrative would make Muslims the heroes of their own story. So where do we start? Firstly, we need to recognise that it is an Islamic duty to stand up for our rights and other Muslims worldwide. Secondly, it is vital that we find common ground in wanting to fight the Islamophobic narrative, ridding ourselves of sectarian differences and uniting as an ummah for the greater goal. Furthermore, we need to understand that if we don't write our own story, we will continue to be punished, oppressed and discriminated. If we don't tackle these narratives, people and the future generations will continue to believe the falsehood out there. Because there is little or no opposing narrative, the lies and poison have spread to the extent where Muslims are hated everywhere, and our narrative must be spread everywhere. In support for those people who speak up and expose war crimes in the media and political parties, in mosques and Islamic institutions in every other part of society, a strong Muslim narrative will make Muslims heroes of their own story again, because until the lion learns how to write, every story will glorify the hunter.